for those of you who don't know, it's been since last Friday, the UAW decided to start striking in 3 plants, specifically doing these stand-up strikes or like targeted strikes. They're asking for 40% pay increase, a 32-hour work week, which I'm like, yes. Eliminating tiered compensation, which I think is really important. UPS had this, and the Teamsters had this same complaint. And then here's President Shaw Fain just yesterday breaking down a little bit more about what they're going through and then what they're gonna do if they don't get their demands met soon. Take a look.
The big 3 CEOs have increased their already massive salaries by an average of 40% over the last 4 years, while the companies have poured billions into stock buybacks and special dividends to enrich Wall Street. Car companies are fleecing consumers right now. In the past 4 years, the average price of a new car is up 30%. You think UAW wages are driving that increase? Think again. Our pay has risen a mere 6% over the last 4 years. If we don't make serious progress by noon on Friday, September 22nd, more locals will be called on to stand up and join the strike. That will mark more than a week since our first members walked out. And that will mark more than a week of the Big 3 failing to make progress in negotiations toward reaching a deal that does right by our members.
I love the countdown clock. We will call upon more plants to walk out. So David, I guess your thoughts on this particular union fight. And I know that Biden has sent officials over there or to Detroit. Is that correct?
I think he wanted to, and then Shaw Fain said, "Go away." And so
like,
sent him back. Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah. So I mean, look, I guess I'm, Shaw Fain's really like as a president, kind of out in front, stepping up, has these like incredible choice quotes. I guess I wanted your thoughts on whether you think, I don't know, playing a little bit of, before we get into the weeds of this, like, do you think the Big 3 are scared? You know what I mean? We see that someone like the AMPTP, that entity, doesn't seem all that concerned and has let this other strike go on.
Well, I think the Big 3, they're certainly off balance. I mean, they've doubled their initial offer, at least in terms of wages. They've gone from 9% to each of the Big 3 are now offering a 20% wage increase over the life of the contract. I mean, that's 5% a year, which is not too far over what inflation is. So it's they could stand to do more given the record profits they have. But certainly they've brought up their offer. They're nervous about the uncertainty of this. I mean, the strike is unusual in that it's selective. There's a kind of an attitude of escalation that's tied into it. This, if you don't give me something Friday, I'm going to strike more. They don't know where they are. There was a good story in The Intercept just broke about an hour ago about how some of the companies had pre-positioned their materials because they thought, oh, this place is going to strike, so let's get our stuff out of there. And then that location, it was misinformation. They didn't strike, and they actually had nothing
coming
to actually work on. So, but I mean, the context is that the auto industry is undergoing this huge transition. We're moving to electric vehicles. In one sense, that sort of the party line that you hear is, well, there are fewer parts in electric vehicles, and so that's going to mean it cuts to workers. But I found, and I have a story on this tomorrow, but there's this interesting thing that's been happening since the strike has gone on, which is that workers who are not on strike, who are at the plants that are continuing to work without a contract, one of the tactics that workers are taking to contribute to the effort is to refuse voluntary overtime, which is endemic. That periodically, all the time, really, workers are asked, hey, can you give me 4 more hours after your shift? Can you work through lunch? Can you work through your breaks? That is a portrait of an industry that doesn't have enough workers, right? If you can't meet your targets without giving out time and a half, double time, sometimes triple time for these, then you just simply have a lack of workers. And the idea that the transition to EVs is going to immiserate all of these workers and lay them off, maybe it'll just get these companies right-sized to the workforce that they actually have.
Right.
And in which case it would save them money because they wouldn't be paying time and a half and double time all this time, and they could stand to bring up their pay a little bit more. So I think that we're busting a lot of the myths that we see about the auto industry, about the EV transition, in the tactics that we're seeing the UAW take to fight for the rights.
Yeah, I mean, what I loved about the video that we just played was the fact that Fain is basically saying, look, consumers are getting screwed too. Look at the price of a new vehicle.
Absolutely.
They're going up. Our salaries have only gone up by 6%. CEOs' salaries have gone up by like 40%, 30%, even just the last few years. So I love that. It's like, where's the actual cost coming from? But let's talk about that EV thing, because the narrative you're seeing from a lot of news media is, well, this strike isn't going anywhere because everyone's pivoting to EV. Or an EV, takes less workers. Or you have people like JD Vance and Josh Hawley, who are tweeting out like, the EV supply chains are heavily concentrated in China, and the Biden administration sends billions to that industry every year. Basically blaming Biden for his, climate friendly or friendlier policies, even though, and you can bust this myth, they actually take China out of the equation, maybe at our detriment. But why all the scaremongering around EVs, and what do you understand is fact and what do you understand is fiction from that?
Right. So, in the Inflation Reduction Act, we had this incredible amount of support given to domestic manufacturing, trying to build up that supply chain that is in some ways dependent on China, particularly around EV batteries. There's money available for battery factories, money available for retooling factories in the United States. There's money available to consumers, $7,500 for American-made vehicles. That has been diminished somewhat because if you lease, you can get any car that's made anywhere. So they've tweaked those rules a little bit because we're not yet up to speed on making all the cars that people want in the United States. But to my view of it, and if you combine that with the CHIPS Act, which is trying to get the semiconductors, which a lot of which go into these vehicles, also made in the United States, the attempt is really to onshore that those set of industries and to make sure that the benefits of this transition, which everyone all over the world is going through, some of those benefits rebound to American workers in particular. Now, there were other aspects of this that were put into initial drafts of the bill that were taken out. Thank you, Joe Manchin. And the biggest one is that there was going to be an extra $4,000 of consumer rebate for EVs that were made in the United States by unionized workers. That was going to be the thing that tipped the scales that would help the UAW in their various fights. That was taken out at the last minute, so we don't have that. And the auto companies, the big three, are facing this imbalance. I mean, we do have to establish that, right? I mean, Tesla has a virulently non-union workforce.
Right.
Many of the auto plants that were put together in the South, Volkswagen, my EV, the Volkswagen ID4 is made in Chattanooga, Tennessee, but it's made by non-union workers. Nissan, Hyundai, Rivian, all non-union. Tesla kind of set the standard for that over a decade ago when they were given billions and billions of dollars in loans by the U.S. government without any conditions attached, without the condition of that you have to do union neutrality in an election or anything like that. So, the auto companies are kind of in a bit of a bind. What we can say is that whatever shakes out with this contract, it might help advance unionization at some of these non-union plants. And where this is really happening is in what are called joint ventures between the big three automakers and battery makers, usually foreign battery makers. One of them is called Ultium Cells. That's between LG and General Motors. One of them is, I believe it's called SK On Battery with Ford. And there are other ones as well. So these are companies that are joint ventures between the automakers, US automakers, and foreign battery makers to make battery plants in the United States. However, those contracts are not, if they are union factories, those factories are not covered by the big three master agreement contract.
Right.
And they don't pay very well. The starting salary at Ultium Cells until a few weeks ago was $16 an hour.
And now, this is when they talk about the two tiers within the auto industry.
Well, I mean, there's two tiers, separate subjects, and we can get to that.
Okay, yeah.
Basically, the initial two-tier was after the financial crisis, when we rescued the auto industry, and as a concession, the UAW said, okay, you can hire new employees at less pay than the wage scale of the existing employees.
So not only they got the bailout, but then they got this very long burn of undermining the in-industry.
And that hasn't changed in 15 years.
Part of that was
now,
to make them competitive, which is what they're arguing.
That was the idea. That was their argument.
With the electric cars too, is that like now these record profits are on not electric cars.
Yeah, they're on other vehicles. About 40% of all US vehicles come from the big three. Only about 18% of electric vehicles come from the big three. So clearly they are still making their bacon off of, heavy duty trucks, light duty trucks, SUVs.
Yeah.
So in the talks, it seems like the big three are willing to relent on that initial two-tier. That's because they're creating a new two-tier, right? And the new tiers are through these joint ventures saying that, oh, electric vehicle assembly, that's not covered by the contract. That's a new thing. It's very similar to the writer's strike, actually, saying streaming video, that's a different industry. That's a different subject. We have to negotiate that separately.
Which is what got us
here. Of what's going on. That's kind of what's going on.
We gave them concessions to make streaming profitable, and then the joke of it all is streaming isn't profitable.
Right, and nobody can figure out how to make that business profitable whatsoever. So
because when you don't pay your workers, it's not profitable.
Well, and you also don't give any information to your workers on what is good and what is bad. You actually give no data on what is a popular show and an unpopular show, and so there's no way to actually say, oh, okay, for this popular show you get this royalty. Well, actually, we control all the data. But I digress. When you're talking about the auto industry, then what will happen is you'll have one wage scale for internal combustion engines and another one for electric vehicles, and that will ultimately be probably lower. And then they're fighting with non-union EV companies like Tesla, like Rivian, who are trying to push that even further down the line. So
I mean, and
it's a difficult situation.
Yeah, and we just talked about this climate stuff, the climate march and these talks, and you heard AOC saying, we're talking about a just transition, and that like centers the working class. And this has been the whole thing, is the right and any, fossil fuel companies pitting, workers against saving the environment, against things like EVs. These are the same companies that tried to kill the electric car, right? These are the same companies that were resistant. These are the companies that, were trying to pull the wool over our eyes. And now they're like, oh, it's so expensive. And yet you're having them directly pit green energy policies against union jobs, as you've just laid out. Yeah. And so I think it is still sad. Look, I'm not saying the Inflation Reduction Act didn't do something. It's got a lot there. It's great. Rebates, it's good. But it is sad that even just the thing that got stripped out was yet another rebate versus no. See, anyone who's getting any money is going to have to be union. Sorry, them's the rules, right?
Yeah.
I mean, basically what we have.
Because that would make it competitive. That would make them competitive. And that is what their problem is, or what they're worried about.
What we have in the IRA is there are benefits for prevailing wages and things like that on the construction side. So constructing facilities, you get a boost if your workforce is paid basically at the level of union wages.
So it's like an incentive structure, though, still,
There's
right?
an incentive, within that.
Right.
At the operations level of actually, producing, once the facility is complete, there's nothing. There are no real conditions. The Biden administration has tried to sort of on the back end put them in specifically for things that have grants and loans, not things that go through the tax code. But if you have a grant, they say, okay, we're setting up this grant and we're going to give you more money if you, or we're going to give you greater consideration to get a chunk of this money, I should say, if you have a unionized workforce, or if you say that if the workers want to do a union election, that you'll remain neutral. This actually succeeded in one area. The EPA gave grants for electric buses. There was a bus factory down in Georgia called Bloomberg. There was a existing unionization effort there. The EPA grant conditioned the money on you can't use any of this money to bust the union. The Bloomberg took that grant, didn't use any of the money to bust the union, and the union election was successful. Now they're still working on their first contract, but those are the kinds of things that the administration can do. It's more sort of nudges, right? Saying, look, if you show that you're going to do right by your workers and going to create good jobs, we'll give you greater consideration to actually get this money. And so they're kind of doing what they can. They're hemmed in by the limitations of the law, the fact that so much of it goes through the tax code. But I think there are ways in which they do get it and understand the best way to move this thing forward. Because ultimately, if they don't do this, and if we're just trading $17 an hour jobs at McDonald's for $17 an hour jobs at at unionized or non-unionized electric vehicle plants, we're not going to get the buy-in that you actually are going to need to build the coalition to keep these investments flowing. Because these investments will ultimately, over time, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And certainly the powerful industries that support Republicans do not want that to happen.
Yeah.
And they're ready, willing, and able, if they get the presidency in 2024, to roll back all of these various investments. And only if that's taking something away from people. If it's taking away a crappy job that could be replaced with another crappy job, you're not going to get the pushback that would enable this very important and critical, if for the future of the planet, set of investments to be maintained. I think that's what a lot of people miss.
Yeah. It's just so bad faith, because you see these, just back to the like pitting people against one another, like all these headlines that are like, that are, Elon's going to win, Elon's winning the strike, Elon's winning. It's just like, it is all this race to the bottom politics of like, well, that's what happens when you ask for too much and you shouldn't stand up and you shouldn't go on strike because Elon's going to win.
People think that looks poorly on the workers. It clearly looks poorly on these companies. I mean, these companies have completely mismanaged themselves to the degree that they didn't pounce on the electric vehicle revolution when it came, when they had the chance, number one. Number two, they have diminished their workforce to the degree that they're paying out overtime willy-nilly to everybody just to keep up with demand. Three, they've made a lot of their bets on gas-guzzling vehicles, high, vehicles like the Hummer, vehicles like the SUV, suburban mom kind of vehicles. Four, they've when these EV benefits came forward, they did nothing to support any kind of effort that their workers and their workforce was trying to put together to make sure that those were prosperous jobs. And now five, they moved all their money into buybacks that benefited executives who make giant salaries. So, I mean, I don't have a lot of sympathy for the big three at this point. They seem to be making tons of money. They seem to be benefiting the executives far more than the workers. So the idea that they might lose out on this transition to Tesla, it's like, well, they created that problem themselves.
It's also similar to like what got them in, the workers have done these concessions because of back in the 80s or 90s, I guess it was, when foreign cars became better than American cars. And then so they started to become not competitive. And so then suddenly paying your workers a good living wage wasn't economically viable because they simply weren't making good cars, which is like not the fault of the assembly
And then the
person.
Suburban came out, and all
And-
was well.
and people
but
love
the
it.
average wage at UAW is basically been cut over the last 40 years relative, if you adjust for inflation. I mean,
Right, it used to
these
be
jobs used to be jobs that on a single salary, you could buy a house, you could raise a family, et cetera. These jobs now, some of these temp jobs are as low, as I said, as $16 an hour. They're backbreaking jobs. I mean, we know that, right? So,
Yeah.
the fact that you're also not being compensated for them is doubly awful. I mean, in the initial stages of automobile production, Henry Ford made the insight that if I pay my workers so that they can buy one of these vehicles, then I'll have a consumer base for these vehicles. And that was brought forward further by Walter Reuther during.
And he was a Nazi.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
if he
So
can
to
do it,
use a more admirable comparison, Walter Reuther during was the head of the UAW in the 1940s and 50s. He actually tried to build into his agreement. We have a piece on this actually that went up this week in the late 1940s to make sure that our wages as auto workers rise without raising the cost of the vehicles. That was important to him. That it was purchasing power and cost of living that was just as important to these workers as it was their particular wages. And this is what helped build the middle class.
Yeah.
And that's why I think a lot this resonates. This particular strike resonates with a lot of people because auto workers are seen as, it's not inherent that an auto worker job is a good job, right? It's like really hard to do. It's it exposes you to a bunch of toxicities. It doesn't have to be good, as we're seeing in these various non-union other electric vehicle spaces. But the reason that it's good is that workers use their collective power over the years and help build the middle class. That's what needs.
And the same with the writer. I just two things. One, I want to say that Shaw Fain, being the leader that he is, has not taken the bait to pit green policies and green energy against like good union jobs. Hello, Green New Deal eventually. But I feel like he would be, given how all this shakes out, but like that's a partner, right? That's who you work with for the dream or the green dream, as Nancy would say. But I do want to also say that it's fitting, you look at the writer's strike and the actor's strike and right, the whole like advent of like people of color telling their own stories and being writers and whatnot. And then you see some of these videos in the UAW and like in your mind, the auto worker back in, the 50s and 60s and 70s or whatever is like, a white guy, a man feeding his whole family on this salary. And now it's like a lot of women, a lot of women of color, a lot of people of color. And let us remember, it's not a coincidence that these jobs have been made more precarious and undermined because of who is making up the working class, which are people of color, which are women, and that goes in a place like Hollywood, but then also in, places like auto manufacturing. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.